Book 1, The Highest Good and the Nature of Happiness. Every action, every art, every inquiry, every pursuit. Aristotle begins from an observation that seems almost too simple to be philosophical, but turns out to be the hinge on which everything else turns. Everything aims at something. The archer aims at the target. The doctor aims at health. The general aims at victory. And if every activity aims at some good, then there must be something that is the highest good. The thing aimed at for its own sake, and not for the sake of anything else. That thing, Aristotle says, is eudaimonia, which is almost always translated as happiness, but which carries none of the modern word's connotations of pleasant feeling. Eudaimonia is better understood as flourishing, as living and doing well, as being fully what a human being is capable of being. The question then becomes, what is eudaimonia specifically? Aristotle surveys the answers people actually give. Some say pleasure, some say wealth, some say honor. He takes each answer seriously and finds each one inadequate, not because pleasure, wealth, or honor are bad, but because none of them is pursued purely for its own sake, and none of them constitutes the whole of a good life. A man honored for cowardice is not flourishing. A man wealthy by theft is not flourishing. Pleasure without virtue produces a life that looks, to Aristotle, less like a human life than like the life of cattle. To get to what eudaimonia actually is, Aristotle introduces one of his most important tools, the function argument. Everything has a characteristic function, he says. A ergon, the thing it does that nothing else does, or that it does best. The function of a knife is to cut. The function of a flautist is to play the flute. What is the function of a human being? Aristotle reasons carefully. It is not merely to live, plants live. It is not merely to perceive, animals perceive. The distinctive function of a human being is to exercise the rational part of the soul well. Eudaimonia, then, is the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. And if there are several virtues, in accordance with the best and most complete. What is striking here is how thoroughly Aristotle ties human goodness to human nature. There is no gap between what we are and what we ought to be. The good life is not the life that follows an external law or satisfies a divine command. It is the life that fully actualizes what we already are. The soul, the rational capacity, the natural orientation toward excellence. These are not obstacles to be overcome, but the very substance of moral life. Aristotle's Ethics begins from the inside of a human being, and it never leaves. The book closes with some methodological honesty. Aristotle acknowledges that he cannot achieve mathematical precision in ethics. The subject matter doesn't permit it. What he offers is an account that is true for the most part, that holds under normal conditions among normal human beings, living in genuine communities. This is not a weakness of his philosophy, but a feature. He is describing something real, and reality is not a geometry problem. Book 2, Moral Virtue, How It is Acquired. If eudaimonia is activity in accordance with virtue, then the next question is obvious. What is virtue, and how does a person get it? Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics is one of the most influential passages in the history of moral philosophy. And it turns on a distinction that sounds simple, but has profound consequences. There are two kinds of virtue, Aristotle says: intellectual virtues and moral virtues. Intellectual virtues, wisdom, understanding, practical judgment, are mostly developed through teaching, through learning and experience over time. Moral virtues are different. They are not taught. They are habituated. This is the core insight of Book 2. Moral virtue comes from doing. You become courageous by acting courageously. You become just by performing just acts. You become temperate by exercising restraint repeatedly, over time, until the restraint is no longer an effort but a settled disposition of character. The Greek word for moral virtue is arete, and the word for moral character is ethos, from which comes the word ethics itself. Character, ethos, is formed by habits, ethia. Aristotle is making a point about the architecture of moral formation. The soul takes on the shape of what it repeatedly does. This has immediate practical consequences. It means that ethics is not primarily about knowing the right answer, but about being the right kind of person. A man who knows that courage is good, but trembles in battle and runs is not courageous. No matter what his beliefs are, a man who is just only when watched is not truly just. The virtues are stable dispositions, hexeis, that express themselves naturally without internal conflict because they have been ingrained through practice. The goal of moral education is not to teach doctrines but to form souls. Aristotle then introduces one of his most famous ideas, the doctrine of the mean. Every moral virtue is a mean between two extremes, both of which are vices. Courage is the mean between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity is the mean between miserliness and profligacy. Honesty is the mean between self-deprecation and boastfulness. The mean is not a mathematical midpoint. It is the right amount in the right circumstances for the right person, expressed in the right way. Aristotle is at pains to emphasize that hitting the mean is genuinely difficult. It requires judgment, experience, and the developed capacity for discernment that comes only from years of living well. What makes this vision so compelling is its realism. Aristotle does not pretend that virtue is easy, that good intentions are enough, or that moral life can be reduced to following rules. Character is built slowly, through repeated choices, under the influence of good communities, good teachers, and good habits instilled early. This is why, he notes at the end of the book, it matters enormously how young people are raised. The soul is not a passive receptacle for abstract principles, it is a living thing, shaped by what it does. Book 3, Voluntary Action, Choice and the Individual Virtues, Courage and Temperance. Before Aristotle can give a full account of the individual virtues, he has to clear the ground on a fundamental question. What makes an action the kind of thing that can be praised or blamed at all? Book 3 opens with his analysis of voluntary and involuntary action, one of the earliest and most careful treatments of moral responsibility in Western philosophy. An action is involuntary, Aristotle says, when it proceeds from external compulsion or from ignorance of the particular circumstances. A man thrown overboard in a storm is not acting voluntarily. A man who unknowingly gives poison instead of medicine is not guilty of murder. But a man who acts from his own appetites and emotions, even if those appetites overwhelm his reason, is acting voluntarily. We cannot excuse ourselves from responsibility simply because we wanted something very badly. The desire itself, Aristotle says, is part of who we are. Between voluntary and involuntary action lies something Aristotle calls prohairesis, deliberate choice. This is the specifically human mode of action, the one that is most fully ours. We deliberate about means to ends, weigh options, and then choose. The object of choice is always something achievable by our own action. We do not deliberate about the laws of geometry or the movements of the stars. These are not in our power. We deliberate about what we can do, and in doing so, we express what we truly value. Character is revealed not in what happens to us, but in what we deliberately choose. With this foundation established, Aristotle turns to the first two major virtues, courage and temperance. Courage is the mean with respect to fear and confidence. The courageous man feels fear. He is not insensible, but he feels it in proportion to the actual danger and responds appropriately. The reckless man feels too little fear or rushes toward danger without judgment. The coward feels too much or lets legitimate fear overwhelm him when action is required. The paradigm case of courage for Aristotle is the soldier facing death in battle, though he extends the concept more broadly. What matters is that courage is not the absence of feeling, but the right ordering of feeling in relation to reason. Temperance governs pleasures of the body, food, drink, and sexuality. The temperate person enjoys these things as nature intends, without excess or deficiency. Aristotle has little patience for the person who claims to find no pleasure in bodily goods at all. He calls this a deficiency, almost a deformity. The goal is not ascetic denial, but harmonious enjoyment. The pleasures of the body are good. The problem is when they usurp the governance of reason, when appetite begins to run the person rather than serve them. Temperance is the virtue that keeps pleasure in its right place. What Aristotle is doing in this book, beneath the surface of the analysis, is establishing something that modern moral philosophy often loses sight of. Moral life is not primarily about what you do in crisis moments. It is about who you are, the settled orientations of soul that determine how you feel, what you notice, and what you choose as a matter of course. The virtuous person does not constantly wrestle with temptation. She has become someone for whom virtue is natural. Book 4, The Remaining Moral Virtues. Book 4 is in some respects the most socially vivid section of the Nicomachean Ethics. Here, Aristotle works through a catalogue of virtues and vices that reveals him as a man deeply embedded in the social and political life of the ancient Greek city. A man who cares not just about private character, but about how the excellent person presents himself to a community and how he moves through the world. Generosity comes first. The generous person gives the right amounts to the right people at the right times in the right way. What strikes Aristotle is that generosity is primarily about giving, not receiving. The generous man takes pleasure in giving well, and his giving is governed by reason, not by whim or the desire for recognition. The miser fails by excessive attachment to wealth. The prodigal fails by throwing it away without judgment. Aristotle is more forgiving of prodigality than miserliness. The prodigal at least has the soul facing outward toward others. But both miss the mark. Magnificence is generosity on a grander scale, the virtue appropriate to men of great wealth who undertake great public expenditures. Building a temple, funding a dramatic chorus, equipping a trireme. The magnificent man does this on a scale appropriate to his means and the occasion, without vulgarity or ostentation on one side, and without pettiness on the other. What Aristotle captures here is that wealth in a well-ordered community carries public responsibilities. The great man who hoards is not truly great. The virtue of magnanimity, greatness of soul, megalopsychia, is one of the most striking and, to modern readers, most challenging passages in the book. The magnanimous man knows his own worth and claims it. He is not falsely modest. He does not pretend to be less than he is in order to appear humble. He accepts great honors from great men as his due, and he receives ordinary honors with a certain detachment. He is slow and deliberate in his movements, steady in his manner, unhurried. He remembers favors he has given, but not those he has received. He is capable of genuine contempt for what deserves contempt. This portrait makes modern readers uncomfortable because it looks like pride. And pride is, in the Christian tradition, the root of all sin. But Aristotle's magnanimous man is not proud in the sense of being deluded about his worth. He is accurately self-aware, and his self-awareness gives him a stability that neither the vain man nor the pusillanimous man can achieve. The vanity of the person who claims more than he is worth is unstable. It collapses under scrutiny. The pusillanimity of the person who claims less is a kind of dishonesty that deprives the community of the contribution he could make. The honest reckoning with one's own excellence is, in Aristotle's world, both a virtue and a social necessity. Aristotle also treats wit, truthfulness, proper ambition, and the virtues of social conduct. The mean between obsequiousness and quarrelsomeness in social life. The mean between boastfulness and self-deprecation in self-presentation. These may seem like minor matters, but Aristotle treats them with the same seriousness as courage, because they constitute the fabric of daily life in community. A man who is chronically dishonest about himself, who flatters indiscriminately, or who introduces friction into every social gathering is failing as a social creature, and the human being is, by nature, a social creature. Book 5, Justice. Justice is the queen of the virtues in Aristotle's account, and Book 5 is the longest sustained treatment of a single virtue in the Nicomachean Ethics. It begins with a distinction that does enormous work. There is justice in a general sense, the complete virtue, the disposition to act lawfully and to treat others as they deserve. And there is justice in a particular sense, which concerns specific interactions and distributions among people. General justice is essentially the whole of moral virtue considered in its social dimension. To be just in this broad sense is to be the kind of person who lives by the law and deals fairly with others. It is the complete moral person seen from the outside, from the perspective of the community. Aristotle quotes the ancient saying that justice is the greatest of the virtues, and he agrees, because it is the only virtue exercised not for oneself alone, but for the sake of others. The just man takes no more than his share and gives others what they are owed. In this sense, justice and virtue collapse into each other. Particular justice divides into two kinds. Distributive justice concerns the fair allocation of goods, honors, offices, money among the members of a community. Corrective justice concerns the rectification of unjust transactions, whether voluntary, like contracts, or involuntary, like crimes. What is striking about Aristotle's analysis of distributive justice is that he ties it explicitly to the notion of merit. Axios. Distribution should be proportional to what people deserve. But what counts as desert? Here Aristotle is honest about the disagreement. Democrats say freedom, oligarchs say wealth, aristocrats say virtue. Each camp emphasizes the criterion that favors their own kind. Aristotle himself favors virtue as the deepest ground of desert, without pretending that this settles every dispute. The treatment of corrective justice introduces the important concept of reciprocity, the notion that underlies commercial exchange. For a market to function, there must be some way of making things commensurate, of trading shoemaking against house building. What makes this possible, Aristotle says, is money, a conventional standard that allows different kinds of work to be compared. Money is not the measure of value, but the instrument of exchange that approximates it. Without this mechanism, complex cooperative society becomes impossible. There is a quiet profundity here. Aristotle recognizes that trade is not merely an economic phenomenon, but a social one, binding the community together through the articulation of need. Book 5 closes with a reflection on equity, epieikeia, which is Aristotle's recognition that law is general and reality is particular. A law can be perfectly well crafted and still produce injustice in an unusual case that the lawmaker could not foresee. The equitable person knows when the law's letter would betray its spirit and adjusts. Equity is not a violation of justice, but its finest expression, the application of the virtue of justice by a person with the wisdom to see what justice actually requires in a specific situation. This is what a good judge does, and it is what a morally serious person does in every domain of life. Book 6. Intellectual Virtue and Practical Wisdom. This book is the intellectual heart of the entire Nicomachean Ethics, and it introduces the concept that Aristotle considers the master virtue, the one that governs all the others. That virtue is phronesis, practical wisdom, and understanding it is essential to understanding everything else Aristotle says about moral life. Aristotle begins by dividing the rational part of the soul. One part is concerned with things that cannot be otherwise, the necessary truths of mathematics and metaphysics. The other part is concerned with contingent things, things that can be otherwise, the domain of human action and production. The intellectual virtues map onto these two parts. Theoretical wisdom, Sophia, grasps the necessary truths. Practical wisdom, phronesis, governs action in the contingent world. What exactly is practical wisdom? It is the capacity to deliberate well about what promotes human flourishing, not in the abstract, but in particular circumstances right now with these people under these conditions. The person with practical wisdom sees clearly what the situation actually is, grasps what kind of response it calls for, and acts accordingly. It is not a set of rules, but a kind of perception. What Aristotle elsewhere calls the vision of the nous, the mind, attuned to the moral particulars of a situation. Crucially, practical wisdom cannot be separated from moral virtue. A clever person who has no genuine commitment to human flourishing can deliberate efficiently about means, but the ends toward which he deliberates may be corrupt. The person who deliberates brilliantly in service of injustice is not practically wise. He is merely shrewd. True phronesis requires that the ends toward which one deliberates be genuinely good. And genuine goodness of ends comes from moral virtue, the stable, habituated dispositions cultivated over a lifetime. Practical wisdom and moral virtue are not parallel tracks, they are mutually constitutive. You cannot fully have one without the other. Aristotle distinguishes practical wisdom from several things it might be confused with. It is not merely cleverness, the capacity to find efficient means to whatever end is given. It is not mere knowledge of universal principles. A man can know that justice requires giving each his due and still be unjust in every particular case. It is not art or technical knowledge. The craftsman's expertise is about making things, and the product stands apart from the maker. Practical wisdom is about being, not making. What phronesis ultimately is a kind of attentiveness to the particular, the concrete, the human, the now. The book also treats scientific knowledge, intuitive understanding, and theoretical wisdom, completing the picture of the intellectual life. Aristotle is careful not to rank theoretical wisdom below practical wisdom or vice versa. They are different excellences of different parts of the soul, aimed at different objects. The philosopher contemplating eternal truths and the statesman governing a city are both in their respective domains, exercising the intellect as well as it can be exercised. Both are expressions of the human being at full stretch. What unites them is the same orientation, toward truth, toward what is actually real. Book 7. Weakness of Will, Pleasure and Continence. There is a problem in moral life that the theory of virtue, taken alone, does not fully address. What about the person who knows what is right, genuinely intends to do it, and yet in the moment of action does the opposite? What about the person who resolves to eat moderately, walks into the kitchen and eats too much, not because he changed his mind, but because something overcame his intention? This is the phenomenon Aristotle calls akrasia, weakness of will. And Book 7 is his sustained attempt to understand it. The puzzle was sharpened by Socrates, who had argued that it was impossible to act against one's own best judgment, that if a man did what seemed to be wrong, it must be that in that moment he genuinely believed it to be right. Aristotle respects Socrates, but thinks this explanation saves the coherence of moral psychology at the cost of obvious truth. People clearly do act against their better judgment. The question is how? Aristotle's answer is subtle and involves his account of how practical reasoning actually works. Moral deliberation proceeds through something like a practical syllogism, a general principle, sweet things are pleasant, a particular perception, this is sweet, and a conclusion that issues in action. The person with akrasia has, at the moment of temptation, their universal knowledge somehow inactive. It is there in the way a drunk man has his knowledge of geometry, present but not operative. What overrides it is the force of appetite, which seizes on the particular perception and drives action before reason can reassert itself. This is why habituation matters so much. The person of genuine virtue doesn't face this battle, or faces it less fiercely because their appetites have been formed alongside their reason. The merely continent person, the one who does the right thing through gritting his teeth, fighting desire all the way, is better than the incontinent person, but he is not yet fully virtuous. The virtuous person acts rightly with pleasure, without internal warfare, because his desires and his reason are aligned. Akrasia is what happens when they are not. Book 7 also contains an extended treatment of pleasure that anticipates Book 10. Aristotle argues against those who claim that pleasure is simply not a good. This strikes him as too extreme and contrary to lived experience. Pleasure is not a process leading to a good state. It is itself the unimpeded activity of a natural faculty. When a healthy person sees clearly, the seeing itself is pleasant. Pleasure is the bloom on virtuous activity, not an addition from the outside, but the completion that a well-functioning activity naturally carries with it. This means that the question is not whether to seek pleasure, but which pleasures, and the pleasures of virtue, Aristotle will argue, are the highest and most durable of all. Book 8, Friendship, Its Nature and Forms. Aristotle devotes more space to friendship than to any other topic except happiness itself, and this proportion alone tells you something about how he understands human life. Books 8 and 9 together constitute one of the most profound treatments of human relationship in the philosophical tradition, and they begin with an observation that is both simple and far-reaching. Friendship, philia, is a necessity, not a luxury. No one, however wealthy or powerful, would choose to live without friends. And more, friendship is bound up with virtue and human flourishing in ways that cannot be separated. Aristotle distinguishes three kinds of friendship, organized by what each party values in the other. Friendships of utility are based on what each person gets from the relationship. The business partners, the acquaintances who help each other out. Friendships of pleasure are based on enjoyment of each other's company. The companions who share a pastime, the young people whose friendships are often driven by the intensity of feeling. Both of these are genuine friendships of a kind, but they are fragile. When the utility ends or the pleasure fades, the friendship dissolves. The third kind, friendship based on virtue, on genuine goodness of character, is the complete form. In this friendship, each party loves the other for what the other actually is. The virtuous friend wishes good things for the friend's own sake, not for what can be extracted from the relationship. This kind of friendship is rare because it takes time and genuine knowledge of each other's character. It cannot be rushed. It develops slowly, through shared activity, shared difficulty, shared attention to living well. But when it exists, it is one of the great goods of human life. What makes Aristotle's account so striking is that he sees friendship not as a supplement to the moral life, but as partially constitutive of it. The virtuous person, through genuine friendship, comes to see himself more clearly. The friend functions as a kind of mirror for the self, showing the person what he is and what he might become. More than that, the shared life of genuine friends, the daily conversation, the meals together, the joint pursuit of honorable activities, is itself a form of flourishing. This is not sentimentality. It is the recognition that the human being is a social creature in the deepest possible sense, and that virtue and happiness are not solo achievements, but communal ones. Aristotle also uses this book to discuss civic friendship, the bond that holds a political community together. He connects philia to justice, arguing that the more genuine the friendship among citizens, the less they need formal legal mechanisms to regulate their relationships. Where there is genuine care, elaborate contract is unnecessary. This connection between friendship and justice is one of the quiet threads that runs through the entire ethics and into the politics. Good political communities are held together not by power alone, but by genuine affection and shared commitment to living well. Book 9, Friendship, Its Deep Nature and Its Relation to Self-Love. The second book on friendship goes deeper, pressing on questions about the inner structure of genuine love and its relationship to the way a person relates to himself. Aristotle begins here by analyzing what it is that friends actually want for each other and from each other, and he arrives at a remarkable claim. The things we want for a genuine friend are the same things we want for ourselves. We want the friend to exist, to live, to spend time with us, to pursue good things with us, to share in sorrow and joy. This leads Aristotle to one of the most discussed passages in the entire work, his account of proper self-love. The man of vicious character is often in conflict with himself. What he does and what he values are out of alignment, and this produces a kind of internal dissonance, a running away from oneself that takes the form of distraction, company, forgetfulness. The virtuous man, by contrast, is at home with himself. He genuinely enjoys his own company. His memories give him pleasure rather than shame. His inner life is coherent and settled. This is the foundation of what Aristotle calls proper self-love. Not vanity or self-indulgence, but the natural affirmation of a self that has become genuinely good. Proper self-love, far from being opposed to love of others, is its precondition. The man who hates himself, who is in flight from himself, cannot love others steadily. His relationships will be colored by his own instability and need. The genuinely virtuous man extends toward others the same steady goodwill he bears toward himself, because he is settled enough to genuinely attend to another person. Self-love, properly understood, is not selfishness. It is the inner wholeness that makes selfless love possible. The book also takes up the question of whether the happy person needs friends at all. Could a man of complete virtue, with all the goods of life, be fully flourishing without any friends? Aristotle's answer is no, and the reason he gives is profound. The happy person's activity, the excellent exercise of his capacities, is both enhanced by witnessing the activity of virtuous friends and partially constituted by the shared life. Seeing another person's goodness, sharing in it, being changed by proximity to it, this is not a supplement to flourishing, but part of its texture. Solitary flourishing is a philosophical fantasy. Actual flourishing is irreducibly communal. Book 9 closes with a reflection on the importance of shared activity in friendship, living together, sousi, not merely coexisting, but genuinely sharing a life, pursuing the same things, spending time in joint activity directed toward noble ends. For human beings, unlike cattle who graze together, this shared activity must include speech and thought. The deepest form of human communion is the shared conversation about things that matter: the good, the just, the beautiful, the true. This is the highest expression of friendship, and it points beyond friendship towards something still larger that Aristotle will address in the final book. Book 10, Pleasure and the Highest Happiness, Contemplation. The final book of the Nicomachean Ethics returns to pleasure in order to give its most complete account, and then delivers what many readers find the most surprising and most profound passage in the entire work: Aristotle's argument that the highest human happiness is the life of philosophical contemplation. The treatment of pleasure completes what was begun in Book 7. Aristotle argues against Eudoxus, who had claimed that pleasure was the highest good because everything pursues it, and against Plato's skeptics, who saw pleasure as inherently suspect. Pleasure, Aristotle argues, is not itself an activity, but the completion of an activity. The bloom that appears when a natural faculty is functioning without obstacle. Different pleasures are distinguished by the activities they complete. The pleasures of a philosopher are different in kind from the pleasures of a drunkard, not merely in degree, but in their very nature. And if activities differ in worth, so do their pleasures. The highest pleasures belong to the highest activities. This sets up the climactic argument of Book 10. What is the highest activity available to a human being? Aristotle's answer is the activity of the highest part of the soul, the intellect, the nous, engaged with the highest objects, the eternal, necessary, unchanging truths of reality. Philosophical contemplation, theoria, is the most self-sufficient activity, requiring the least from external circumstances, producing the greatest pleasure, most continuous, most complete. The life of contemplation is the life most fully divine in the human being, and to the extent that a person can live it, that person is most fully alive. This conclusion has generated enormous debate. Does Aristotle think that the political, social, virtuous life described in the preceding 9 books is less than fully happy? Is the statesman, the friend, the just man somehow falling short of the philosopher? Aristotle's answer, read carefully, seems to be that the fully human life integrates both: the practical virtues exercised in community and the contemplative capacity pursued as far as possible, with contemplation representing the apex of what we can be. We are not pure intellects, and the practical life is genuinely good. But we have within us a capacity for something that exceeds the merely human, and to neglect it is to live below our own nature. The book closes with a transition to political science. Aristotle acknowledges that knowing what the good life is does not automatically produce good people. Moral formation requires communities, laws, institutions, habituation from childhood. The ethics thus flows naturally into the politics, where Aristotle will ask how communities must be structured to produce genuinely flourishing human beings. The individual and the community are not separable in his thought. The Nicomachean Ethics is not a self-help manual for private individuals. It is the moral foundation of a complete political philosophy. The Nicomachean Ethics leaves the reader with something rare in philosophy: a picture of the good life that is simultaneously demanding and recognizable. Aristotle does not ask us to transcend our nature or deny our desires. He asks us to fulfill our nature, to develop the capacities we actually have, to exercise them excellently in community with others, to cultivate the habits and friendships and practical wisdom that make a human life genuinely good, rather than merely comfortable. This is hard, he admits. It takes time, good community, honest self-examination, and the willingness to be formed by something larger than one's immediate wants. But it is not impossible, and the path is written into the very structure of what we are. The person who has been properly raised, who lives in a good community, who cultivates genuine friendships and exercises the virtues over a lifetime. That person is not straining towards some alien ideal. He is becoming, at last, fully himself. What makes the Nicomachean Ethics inexhaustible is that it treats human nature as real, moral truth as discoverable, and the good life as something that can be lived, not imagined, not theorized about endlessly, but actually lived in a particular body, in a particular community, in a particular time. At a moment when much of public moral discourse has collapsed into the assertion of preferences, the management of grievances, and the endless negotiation of identities with no fixed referent, Aristotle offers something almost countercultural, the conviction that human beings have a nature, that this nature has an end, and that the whole task of ethics is to figure out how to hit it.